Buongiorno a tutti, io vi ringrazio di essere connessi a questo nuovo appuntamento, il quarto appuntamento del Premio Galileo, con questa nuova presentazione che segue quelle già avvenute di Telmo Pievani, di Piero Martin e di Francesca Buoninconti lo scorso 13 di maggio a Padova. Oggi abbiamo un appuntamento totalmente in diretta e quindi saluto chi è collegato da YouTube, dal canale del Comune di Padova. Tra l'altro colgo l'occasione per ricordare anche gli altri canali. Su Facebook ci trovate su premio.galileo.padova e su Instagram su Premio Galileo 2022. Il nostro sito ufficiale è premiogalileo.eu, dove vi segnaleremo anche il prossimo appuntamento con Benjamin Labatù. Voglio ringraziare però assolutamente, partire così da un ringraziamento al settore cultura del Comune di Padova, che da 16 anni ospita il Premio Galileo, e voglio ringraziare anche l'Università degli Studi di Padova, anche nella figura della magnifica rettrice Daniela Mapelli, che in questa edizione è anche coinvolta come presidentessa di giuria. Voglio a questo punto presentarvi gli ospiti di oggi, a partire da Giovanni Caprara, che è uno degli 11, insieme appunto alla rettrice che vi citavo prima, giurati che hanno contribuito alla decisione che ha portato Rebecca Wragg Sykes tra i primi 5 finalisti di questa 16ª edizione. Giovanni Caprara, che è editorialista scientifico del Corriere della Sera, mi piace ricordare un aneddoto particolare. Lui nasce proprio con la passione per lo spazio. Pensate che a 15 anni progettava e lanciava proprio dei razzomodelli in campagna a Verona, e solamente a 17 anni fondava il gruppo di ricerche spaziali, e poi diciamo comincia la sua carriera giornalistica con proprio l'Arena di Verona, finché nel 1972 comincia la sua carriera giornalistica con il Corriere della Sera, e poi anche El País d'Aviation Week. Però Giovanni Caprara è anche autore di numerosi volumi sulla storia della scienza in Italia e negli Stati Uniti, non da ultimo l'ultimo volume edito anche in Cina, ed è docente anche di storia dell'esplorazione spaziale al Politecnico di Torino. Perdonatemi, di Milano. Io però voglio assolutamente accogliere in questo appuntamento digitale Rebecca Wragg Sykes. Rebecca, che è un'archeologa del Paleolitico britannico, di lei mi piace anche ricordare la sua appartenenza ad un gruppo che effettivamente è stato fondato anche da lei, che è il gruppo delle Trailblazers, cioè delle donne che si occupano di archeologia e di paleontologia. Rebecca è oggi Honorary Fellow alla School of Archaeology dell'Università di Liverpool, ma anche in Francia all'Università di Bordeaux. Mi piace partire con una citazione di Yuval Noah Harari, che proprio sul suo libro Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, dice di Rebecca Wragg Sykes e del suo volume Neanderthal, che è un lavoro notevole che riesce a sintetizzare migliaia di studi accademici in un'unica narrazione accessibile. E allora io voglio assolutamente accogliere i nostri due ospiti e lascio già da subito la parola al nostro giurato Giovanni Caprara, che avrà modo di presentare la nostra finalista Rebecca Wragg Sykes. E allora vi lascio. Buon appuntamento.
Grazie Alfredo e buongiorno Rebecca.
Hello, nice to be here. I'm honored.
Intanto congratulazioni per questo magnifico viaggio nel nostro passato. Ma entriamo subito nella nostra chiacchierata sull'uomo di Neanderthal, che i suoi resti venivano scoperti 166 anni fa, nel 1856, nella valle di Neander, in Germania, vicino a Düsseldorf. Questi resti naturalmente erano l'inizio di una magnifica storia. Quindi le tracce ritrovate dell'Homo neanderthaliensis, come è stato battezzato scientificamente, documentano una vita tra i 130.000 anni fa e 30.000 anni, ma in realtà il tempo della sua presenza sembra più ampio, risalente anche a 300.000 anni fa, e la sua fine è rimasta misteriosa. aveva vissuto tra Europa, Asia e Africa, e in parallelo per un certo tempo con l'Homo sapiens. E proprio questo aspetto sembra essere una delle possibili cause della sua scomparsa. Ma vediamo un po' dopo le ipotesi della sua fine, questa storia straordinaria dell'uomo di Neanderthal. Tra l'altro devo confessare che io ho un debole per questa storia, perché essendo nato a Verona, vicino a Verona, nella grotta di Fumane, è stato scoperto, come sai benissimo, un esemplare di Neanderthal che è entrato tra le ricerche che da allora sono state compiute. E quando sentivo parlare e scrivere anche sul giornale di questa presenza, ne ero affascinato e lì è cominciata la mia debolezza per l'uomo di Neanderthal che mi ha sempre accompagnato nel tempo. Ma intanto, come tu racconti nel libro Neanderthal, Vita, arte, amore e morte, pubblicato da Bollati Boringhieri in Italia, era una specie di notevole ricchezza umana, di capacità e di sensibilità. Tu sei archeologa e divulgatrice, ma perché ti sei soffermata proprio su questo argomento, scrivendo addirittura un libro?
Well, I'm really pleased to hear that you know about Fumani already, because it is one of the most important Neanderthal sites, and obviously Italy has many really, really significant Neanderthal sites, and Fumani is just one of them. But I think, why did I write the book? I kind of feel like this book was always waiting to come out from me. My background is somebody who, as a child, was always drawn to explore and understand the past, but even more than wishing to know facts or information, I was always wanting to imagine myself in the deep past. And as I started training as an archaeologist, I realized that to do this is even more of a challenge the older that you get. And as I went through my academic career, I specialized in Neanderthal archaeology, and I was trained in stone tool analysis. But all the way through, I had a parallel continuing interest from childhood and after that in writing and in communicating science and in sharing all of the context for what we know about Neanderthals, because Neanderthals are like a celebrity in human origins. They are extremely well known, well publicized in broader popular culture, and often you have some discoveries and they will be in the newspapers, on the internet, but there is a enormous surrounding, very rich contextual understanding about their lives, all sorts of aspects about their lives that only really specialists like me who work in this period have access to that information to understand the setting of the Neanderthal world and really try to reconstruct what was it like to be a Neanderthal. And so I wanted to use my expertise as a scientist and as a writer to actually share and sort of help other people really put themselves back in this deep past that is the literal heritage of everybody in the world.
Cerchiamo di costruire un identikit dell'uomo di Neanderthal, perché certamente intorno a lui sono nate molte fantasie anche, qualcuno esagera un po', qualche altro diminuisce. Ecco, raccontaci tu l'uomo di Neanderthal che hai incontrato. Che caratteristiche aveva?
I think I would say two things. One is that, speaking just as a scientist, I think it's a fair representation of the field of archaeology now to say that Neanderthal should be understood as another kind of human. So in an evolutionary sense, when you look at the chronology of where they fit into the broader tree of human evolution, they're very close to us in terms of evolutionary relationships and also in time. You know, they're not 5 million years ago. They are living at the same time as the lineage that would lead to Homo sapiens is living. So they're very close. And from the last 30, 40 years of archaeology, all sorts of different discoveries, including genetics, of course, it really underlines that they're not the same as us, but they are another kind of human. So I think this is the baseline on which this book could be written. And this is my sort of perspective on them as a scientist, that I have. I give them an expectation of complexity that we would give sort of anybody that we think of as a human. They're not necessarily going to be the same, but I don't sort of reduce them to a negative from the beginning. And my second perspective, I guess, in having written the book and had the incredible opportunity to, you know, spend several years investigating and just dive into the science and look at all sorts of fascinating details and have a very broad synthetic view. My perspective on them has really, I think, solidified around the idea that they were extremely successful and capable in the lives that they were leading, especially the fact that when you write a book like this one, which is, I chose to structure it thematically, not chronologically. And by doing that, it allowed me to make connections between all different aspects of their lives. And the thing that comes out really clearly is how conscious they were in their decisions, how systematic, how complex, but also how aware they are of the quality of life. They are material connoisseurs, and this is the impression I have of them.
Ma loro hanno realizzato strumenti diversi, erano degli innovatori della tecnologia in un certo senso, però sapevano anche abbinare alla funzionalità dello strumento una certa bellezza. Ecco, condividi questo aspetto? Loro ricercavano anche appunto una forma estetica alle cose?
Yes, I do. I think this is one of the aspects, as I say, that sort of really came forward in my mind from examining all different aspects of how they lived. And yeah, the idea of a connectivity between technology and aesthetics. You can kind of make up a word, technesthetics, maybe. This covers the concept of how we can see different aspects of their knowledge and skills going across different sorts of material interactions. And there's all sorts of examples that we can look at. In fact, some really great examples from Italy. Everybody knows Neanderthals made stone tools. There's all sorts of different systematic approaches to stone tool technology, but they also did things with other materials. For example, from several Italian sites and Greek sites, we can see that they apply the same skill that they have with stone to shell. So there is an impression of a regional shell tradition, maybe. And there's also really recent exciting discovery from Italy and from Poggetti Vecchi of a lot of wooden tools, which is joining evidence that we have from other sites in Europe, which show that Neanderthals understood different species of trees, would have different properties in terms of the wood that they offer. And at this Italian site, they're using boxwood, which is a very dense species for digging sticks. It makes the perfect choice. But in terms of aesthetics, there are so many different discoveries from the past couple of decades, really, which together when you look at them as a whole, they really suggest that Neanderthals in some times and places are consciously experimenting with the effect of altering surfaces. So this might be engraving bones or incising lines, or it can be using color. And you talked about Fermani. Fermani is a great example because it has an object which I always love to talk about in talks, because it's a really perfect example of the kind of discovery you would want to prove something is not a practical object, that it's an artifact that goes beyond practicality. And this is a very small shell from Grotto Fermane, which is not waste from eating shellfish. For a start, it's not near the sea, but also the species of shell, we can see that this is actually a fossil shell, which was collected probably 100 kilometers away from that site, picked up probably as a curiosity, because they recognize shells, they know shells, but this is a shell made of stone. And Neanderthals, I think, would be very well aware of their environment, constantly looking and assessing for resources. And this was noticed. It was carried, we don't know how long for or by how many Neanderthals, and eventually it's left at Grotto Fermane. And on the outside of this shell, which is already an unusual object, on the outside of the shell there is red pigment, which itself came from 40 kilometers in a different direction. So in this one object, you have two unusual substances which have no very clear practical purpose, but make sense as an emergent case of aesthetic experimentation, of altering the surface of an object that's unusual, that's attracted attention, presumably for a visual effect. We don't know anything else about this object, but we do know Neanderthals were hunting and gathering people. They were moving across landscapes all the time. They didn't have cars or anything to carry their possessions. So anything that they carry with them must have significance for them. It must be valuable in some way. And so this object, I think, is a really good example of many other individual cases we have like this, for thinking that Neanderthals are experimenting as artisans in the technologies that they have, but also as humans experiencing and playing with the material world.
Ma leggevo che secondo alcuni l'uomo di Neanderthal era anche un cannibale. È vero o no?
It is true. In some sites, what we can see is the remains of some Neanderthals were taken apart, basically butchered in a fairly similar way to what they do with some of the animals that they eat. And in some cases, we have actual evidence for eating, for example, some burning or some tooth marks on the bones. For us, as Western European viewers or thinkers, this is something quite difficult to understand what's going on. And the first thing that people often feel is a kind of fear or a disgust about this. But I think we have to view this activity within a broader understanding of what it means to interact with bodies, because in a lot of the circumstances where there is eating or butchery of bodies, there is not necessarily good evidence that Neanderthals were doing this because they were starving, or because necessarily that there was a conflict or an aggression. It might be true in some cases, but I don't actually think that there is a need to have this as the base viewpoint to understand this behavior, because what we also know is Neanderthals are doing other things with the bodies of the dead. And in some cases, this includes depositing whole bodies, sometimes the bodies of very young infants or older individuals. And considering that we can see that there is an interest in the dead and an interest with doing things with the bodies, I think, and other researchers also think that this should be viewed as part of a diverse range of what they might have been doing with the dead. And, you know, the idea of manipulating bodies and things might sound a little bit unexpected, but in fact, even in Christian tradition, there is a focus on the sacredness of the body and of maintaining connections to bodies. We have saintly relics. So, of course, this is not the same thing in a Neanderthal context. But the point is, people are drawn to the physical remains of others as the site around which they process traumatic emotions that come from a death. So if we think of ourselves as primates, which we are, and we look at our closest living primate relations, so chimpanzees and bonobos, the other closely related kind of chimpanzee, they live in very small groups. Their social relationships are all built around intense emotional attachments, as ours are, and as we would expect Neanderthals also to be. And when there is a death within their groups, the body is absolutely the focus of very intense attention. They will sit with bodies for a long time. They manipulate the bodies. Sometimes they try to groom them. Sometimes they do eat them. So I think actually what we might be seeing with Neanderthals is a way of expressing the emotional pain of losing a close individual. That's something that we share, whatever culture you're from across the planet. There's all different ways that it is the correct way to deal with the dead. We do all sorts of stuff. Some of it looks very strange depending on where you come from in the world. But we can see that this is a very ancient thing to focus on bodies, and we see it with our common primate relatives as well. So I think, of course, in some situations, maybe there's aggression, maybe it's connected to that. But I think, as with how we think about all different aspects of Neanderthal lives, that we need to see them as another form of a way of being human, and the expectation that they would find death a hugely painful, emotionally shattering experience, and that they would wish to interact with the bodies of the dead, perhaps rather than grooming them, as we see with chimpanzees, using their tools on their bodies, which they do every day with the bodies of animals. Maybe this is not something disrespectful. Maybe this is something actually about reverence.
Secondo te non c'è contraddizione tra la forma di cannibalismo e il rispetto del corpo che veniva accudito, sepolto e quindi rispettato? Non sembrano due estremi abbastanza inconciliabili.
I think that's depending on your individual perspective. You only have to look at ethnography and historic record, even in Europe, and what one does with the remains of the dead. Every possibility you can think of, humans have done it. And those contexts are about respect for individuals. So after the Neanderthals, the Homo sapiens cultures that followed the Neanderthals, the same people who, produced incredible art and beautiful burials covered in beads, all of this kind of thing, they are also taking bodies apart and moving bits around and doing things. And in other cases, in later prehistoric contexts, we also see evidence for body processing and sometimes what looks like cannibalism as well. And in those situations, based on what we see from the whole global culture today, the consumption of individuals doesn't have to be something that signals disrespect or aggression or anything like that. It can be a way of trying to retain a closeness to an individual, or, depending on the exact culture, it can be about trying to sort of take on the essence of an individual. We don't know the motivations of Neanderthals in all the cases, but I think that we should assume that Neanderthals living in different times and different places in their world did things differently. They had their own cultural variety. We see this in the technology that they used, in other aspects. So I would think if in some places they are burying the remains whole of individuals, and they're doing something different in another place, that doesn't mean that those are morally opposed practices or choices. It just means that there could be cultural diversity within the Neanderthal world. And I think this is a problem we always have as archaeologists, and as scientists, that we bring our own sort of personal background, cultural mindset to the work that we do, and we have to try to see the Neanderthals on their own terms. And that's not to say that there was no violence or aggression or sometimes starvation in these Neanderthal contexts. There probably was sometimes, but I don't think that we can have that we can rule out these other possibilities based on the complexity of what we see them doing more broadly.
Nel 2010 si annunciava nella caverna sui monti Altai di aver ritrovato nella Siberia meridionale dei resti che sorpresero notevolmente, per cui nacque con questa scoperta l'Homo di Denisova, una specie che si parallela a quella di Neanderthal, che secondo alcuni si era separata dallo stesso Neanderthal 300.000 anni fa. Che è vero questo? Che rapporto c'è fra Neanderthal e Denisova?
As far as we can understand, and it must be remembered that at the moment we still understand Denisovans best from their genetics, because we still don't have very many skeletal remains from them. But what their DNA says is that they are another lineage that split from the Neanderthals not very long after the Neanderthal lineage had split from us. So they're more closely related to Neanderthals than they are to us. But they are part of this of a Eurasian sort of context of hominin diversity, and they, so far as we can see, something interesting is that they appear to have had a larger overall population, or at least a population that had greater genetic diversity than the Neanderthals. And what we can see from identified discoveries so far is that they are more of an East Eurasian hominin population, whereas Neanderthals are Western Eurasians.
Si sono differenziati anche nelle caratteristiche, nei modi di essere?
Well, at the moment, it's very difficult for us to know, because we've only known about the Denisovans for 10 years. We've known about Neanderthals for more than 165 years. So we have some catching up to do. But so far, what we believe is that Denisovans may have been better able to cope with high altitude contexts than Neanderthals. So Neanderthals were certainly sometimes active in mountain regions. We know, in fact, from some Italian sites in the Alps, we know that they're hunting bears in their dens, sometimes 1,500 meters up, right in the mountains. But we have evidence from Denisovan discoveries that they are active at much higher altitudes, in the Himalayan sort of Tibetan region. And also their genetics points towards being able to biologically cope with those kind of environments as well. So what we would really like is to have some discoveries of sites where we have much more complete physical remains of Denisovans, so we can see, for example, what their faces look like, because we don't know that, what the whole of their body looked like, how that compares to Neanderthals, and also have a clearer understanding of the technology and the range of technologies that they had and how this compares to Neanderthals. But what we do know is that Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens were all sometimes meeting and interbreeding and having hybrid offspring. So these populations, again, were biologically compatible to some extent, and there is an implication that there may also have been a level of cognitive compatibility as well. So what we would really like to see is, or have the same amount of time that we've had with Neanderthals, and we really would like to see that for Denisovans. So this is really exciting future research to work out the relationship between them and Neanderthals. And also, at the moment, we only know for Neanderthals that their easternmost range from this one site, from Denisova in Siberia. They may have gone further east than that, but we haven't got those sites yet. So this is going to be really exciting area for more developments.
Veniamo adesso al grande mistero di Neanderthal, cioè la sua fine. Che cosa è successo? C'è chi dice che la diversità ambientale, la crisi del clima e l'ambiente inaccettabile e difficile da affrontare fosse una ragione. Altri sostengono che l'interazione col Sapiens abbia vinto il Sapiens perché era più intelligente e sapeva gestire, cioè manifestava una supremazia per cui cercava di eliminare il cugino Neanderthal. Ecco, quali sono le vere ragioni, secondo te, della scomparsa di Neanderthal?
Well, obviously this is a question that people always want to know about. And when I wrote the book, I wanted to give most of the book just to talking about Neanderthals for their own sake, for their own interest. But I do come to the question at the end of the book. And I hope that by the end of reading it, people will have sort of reached a new appreciation of why this is a hard question to answer. And when you said, you know, what are the reasons, that's the key point. It's not just one reason, I think. There was a recent scientific article that was published based on asking researchers their opinion. Why do you think Neanderthals were extinct? And what came out of this is that probably climate is not a key factor, because during the last 10, 15,000 years Neanderthals were around, temperatures were getting colder, but it was not extreme Arctic conditions. They had coped with this kind of condition before. The temperature was also very variable, which is a serious problem if you're a hunting and gathering community and you're relying on knowing where resources are available. So climatic instability over short timescales, that obviously that's not good. But Neanderthals had also survived that kind of instability before. So I think for most people working on Neanderthals now, climate maybe is part of the answer, but not the main problem. The other thing that makes it much more complex now to answer the question is that until, probably the last 10 years, it seemed that Neanderthals were in Eurasia and Homo sapiens dispersed from Africa, began to disperse only about 40,000 years ago. So they arrive in Eurasia, and Neanderthals disappear at the same time. That is not what we can see now from the most recent archaeological evidence. Instead, we can see that Homo sapiens populations were beginning to disperse from Africa much, much earlier. We now believe that they are in East Asia, already gone all the way across Eurasia by 80,000 years ago, so twice as long. And we can also see signs from the genetics and from fossils that they are active in sort of the Near East region, well over 150,000 years ago. So the span of time over which Homo sapiens is in the same landscape as Neanderthals is much, much bigger, which means we can't argue anymore for an immediate sort of devastation of Neanderthal populations simply because Homo sapiens arrive. That's not the case. Instead, we have to imagine something that is much more about longer processes, that includes contact between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, some of which resulted in interbreeding. We don't know the social context for the interbreeding, but sometimes some of the babies, the children from those meetings, were raised in Neanderthal groups and in Homo sapiens groups and were able to adapt to those cultures and survive and have their own children. And some of that is what is the genetic legacy which remains in living people today. So that picture is very complicated, but I think something that maybe is coming out as a potential difference that made that may have been important is that even though there is a much longer history of Homo sapiens leaving Africa and moving into Eurasia, we can see cultural differences later on. So in the last 10 to 15,000 years before Neanderthals disappear, so between 55 to 40,000 years ago, we see Homo sapiens people still coming out, but they seem to have different technology. What we might be looking at is evidence for projectile weapons, so very lightweight spears, or in fact bow and arrow technology. And we can see this because of the very tiny size of some of the stone tool tips that we find. That kind of technology in hunting could have made a difference, not necessarily in catching more animals, but in reducing the risk of hunting, because you can keep a distance from the animals. So this might have been part of it. But the other difference that we see with this late Homo sapiens dispersing population is more objects that appear related to aesthetic or symbolic social factors. There's more pigment, more beads, things like this. That may suggest that those populations were functioning differently on a social scale, that they maybe had different forms of social relationships. And what's really interesting is that when you put this with the genetics, what we can see is that the Neanderthals all the time were living in small groups, and they were quite genetically isolated. They never seem to have been very good at maintaining a rich gene pool by being connected with many different other Neanderthal groups. They sometimes had some connections, but it's not very strong. Whereas now, when we look at the skeletal remains from Homo sapiens from this period between 50 to 40,000 years ago, there's not many of them, but when we do look at their DNA, we get a different picture. Their genetics points to them having a much richer, bigger breeding population. So there's probably not very many of them. They still live in small groups, but they are somehow able to maintain a stronger social network, broader social network. Maybe they're able to plan to meet each other much more regularly. And those artifacts, those objects to do with symbolic, aesthetic factors, that's probably the material representation of this different social, possibly cognitive ability to sort of maintain really dispersed populations and cultures. So I think when you put all of these aspects together, that the climate was not good, it was a tricky time, and maybe these new hominin, these new Homo sapiens people have an advantage because they're hunting, the way they hunt is less risky, so they die less often, they have more children, and they have support networks across very large scales in the landscape that can allow them maybe to move to new places, to see people if times are difficult in one area, if the climate's getting bad, if the animals are not there, they can move, and Neanderthals can't do that. That could make a difference, but over long spans of time. So this is going to be a gradual population scale impact, and eventually Neanderthal populations will shrink in all different places. They get smaller and smaller. But I will say that just as with other aspects of their culture, their behavior, we should not expect that the same thing is happening everywhere. What happened to the last Neanderthals in Iberia, in Italy, in Siberia, there's going to be a different picture in each of those places. There will be a different history for what happened and what the different pressures and processes were.
Si può immaginare quale forma di comunicazione utilizzassero, la loro interazione e come avveniva?
Do you mean with each other or with Homo sapiens?
Sì, tra di loro prima di tutto.
I think overall, I think most archaeologists, most people that work on Neanderthals now would say that some kind of talking is happening in their everyday life. We have different areas of evidence for that. It used to be thought maybe they were not able to produce that many sounds, that diverse range of sounds. But now we think probably they were able to make mostly similar range of sounds. And also there is new research on the anatomy inside their ears, which points to them their hearing being tuned in to the same sound frequencies or very similar sound frequencies that our hearing is best at detecting, which is the sound frequencies of human speech. So this is quite a strong argument that some vocal communication is really important to them. There's also some genetic evidence for this as well. There's one particular gene related in us to language and speech. Neanderthals had a very similar version, although not identical to ours, which might indicate that there was a difference in their development. We don't really understand the implications of that, but it's not identical. But what you can also do is look at the archaeology. You know, when we think anything about Neanderthals, we can look at their bodies, we can look at the genetics, and we can make inferences. But the archaeology, which is the primary focus of my book, is about looking what is the material evidence for what they actually did, for what we can see that they were capable of. And in this context, there's a lot of debate still, but you can look at things, for example, looking at hunting. Is it possible to hunt collaboratively using very likely different hunting techniques for different animals? Can you do that with no kind of vocal communication? Or you look at the different technologies that Neanderthals had. There are different sort of specialists who work in cognitive science, cognitive archaeology, and sometimes they will make this argument based on the complexity, the different stages of planning and anticipation within some of the stone tool technologies. But even more, in fact, than the stone tools, I think the fact that we know Neanderthals had composite technology. So this means tools which are made of more than one part. And Neanderthals made glue. In fact, the earliest evidence we have for them making the first ever synthetic material, birch tar glue, comes from Italy, from a site Campitello. And this is more than 200,000 years ago. They knew how to cook birch bark from the trees, cook it, and get this sticky black material, which is a perfect glue. So that is a complicated cognitive process. Then you have to build all the other processes of composite technology in. You have to make your stone, you have to get the wood, but remembering that they're very choosy about the different kinds of wood species they use, the parts of the trees. You have to have a material project to create a composite tool using birch tar, and it's something that will be lasting across probably several days to accumulate all these things, and also in terms of the different levels of planning and attention that's necessary. So all of this is that kind of complicated, multi-layered technological cultural process able to exist and be maintained without any language, any kind of information or vocal communication. I don't think so. But there's a difference between imagining a language that's referring to technologies or things all around you in one sort of place or one time, or maybe talking about a project or an activity. That's like a practical language. But did Neanderthals have a language where they could maybe wake up in the morning and talk about their dreams? This is the kind of, language that people would like to know. Did Neanderthals have this? And we can't say that for sure. But they certainly would have had dreams. There's no question. We know dogs can dream. So yeah, I think that's an aspect that's always going to be difficult. But what does fascinate me is the question of how language may have been involved in the interbreeding, in the meetings between groups, assuming not all of those were violent. I would believe some of those meetings were probably actually based around curiosity. And how did those hybrid babies, those children, learn the languages of the groups? Were they able to fully take on the cultural richness of the groups and learn the language? So there's so many questions we have about language, and some of them we can only answer with a time machine.
C'è un'altra domanda che ci appassiona. Noi abbiamo dei geni di Neanderthal nel nostro patrimonio genetico. Sappiamo che alcuni li abbiamo ereditati e sono utili alla nostra sopravvivenza oggi, altri invece sono fonti di debolezza della nostra struttura genetica. Ecco, questo aspetto come l'avete studiato?
I mean, the whole field of genetics is such a fast-moving, very new area of Neanderthal work. It's only 12 years since we first had a draft genome for Neanderthals, and it's quite amazing actually how quickly the entire area of ancient DNA has exploded really in the amount of information that's possible to get. I think one problem with this is that some of the focus that we have on being able to examine different aspects of Neanderthal biology comes from the fact that a lot of the comparative material we have is related to large sort of medically focused studies. So many of the areas of research, or the headlines that get into the media, it's to do with health, and that's partly because of the context of the research. But what is interesting is that amongst all these different sort of suggestions of this aspect may have come from Neanderthals, this one we didn't want their genes, we kept our own. One thing that comes forward is that genetics related to immunity seem to be quite important, and that was something that we seem to have gained from Neanderthals when Homo sapiens entered Eurasia. And if there is a population that's moving into a new region with new ecologies, you're going to encounter new pathogens, new diseases, new bacteria and things like this. And amongst the interbreeding happening, some of the genetic material that came over into our populations from these hybrid children, some of that is related to immunity. So this is a benefit that we probably gained from Neanderthals, and unpicking all the different details of what is specifically Neanderthal is a project that's going to go on for a very long time. But on the other hand, there was a recent study which suggested that even when you look at Homo sapiens genome as a whole, 90% of our genome is the same as what we share with many other hominins. There's only a tiny proportion that's actually specifically unique to us. So we have material that relates to other hominins as well that we share with them. And of course, there are other interactions as well with Denisovans. And within Africa as well, we must assume that there were other hominin populations and more interbreeding. So there's a huge, rich, shared genetic history, actually. But thinking about Neanderthals, you know, and what we received and what we didn't receive from them, and what we may have benefited from. I do kind of, as an archaeologist, because I'm not a geneticist, I always think about the material side of things as well. And, you know, thinking about the birch tar glue, Neanderthals invented that. That is a Eurasian technological origin, because, you know, the ecology is not there in the African continent. And we can see after the Neanderthals are gone, that technology is present in many other later prehistoric Homo sapiens populations. So perhaps that is one of the other things that passed across during these moments when they were meeting. There was not just transmission of genes, but there was also maybe transmission of knowledge, and culture, and an ability to adapt and to cope with the Eurasian world in ways that were beyond our bodies as well.
Bene Rebecca, adesso ti vorrei sottoporre un paio di domande che sono arrivate da chi ci segue. La prima, molto interessante, è di Silvia Gasparini, che studia lettere all'Università di Padova, e chiede: se i Neanderthal non si fossero estinti, quali possibili scenari si sarebbero presentati per l'evoluzione dell'Homo sapiens?
Wow, this is such a hard question. Yeah, I have been asked this a few times, and it doesn't really get easier to answer this. Basically, it's like science fiction. It's like asking a paleontologist to imagine what the future of evolution is going to look like. It's really difficult. I think the problem is we don't still have a great idea as to why they disappeared, and, you know, whether or not there was any active direct effects of Homo sapiens being involved in that. But if they were still around, and there was no vanishing, I think perhaps we would have things that we've lost. We might have a different way of looking at the world, perhaps. I mean, you know, when people talk about extinction and what happened to the Neanderthals, or even what happened to dinosaurs, there's always an assumption that the reason those organisms are not here is because there was something wrong with them, that they failed, when in fact that's not always accurate. The context for evolution and extinction is always much more complicated, and often luck is a big part of what happens. So maybe some of the things that Neanderthals did or knew, or the way that they thought about the world, some of those things actually could have been incredibly beneficial for us, and we've lost that. You know, the idea that we are the only hominin, the only humans left, as if we have won a competition, I don't actually think that's a great way to look at the situation, being the last one here. is not necessarily a great achievement. But it is interesting to think about the context of whether the Neanderthals' extinction might fit into a pattern that some researchers see with Homo sapiens interactions with animals as well. And, you know, the extinction of many other forms of large animals, especially at the end of the last ice age. Some of that's to do with climate, but also you see a suggestion of when Homo sapiens move into different environments, the local biodiversity shrinks because we appear to have a tendency to not only dominate the environment, but exploit it sort of as far as possible. So in that sense, perhaps even if the Neanderthals had survived for some time, that may have happened anyway. And, you know, you only have to look at sort of various historical contexts where in colonial settings, people have gone into to pre-existing cultures and been extremely aggressive, been highly extractive, and those cultures are essentially, you know, either destroyed or remain in a very tiny remnant form. So, I mean, it comes down to science fiction, right? You know, you can't really know the historical contingencies of the last 40,000 years to argue what life would be like now if Neanderthals were still here. But part of me thinks maybe they wouldn't have made it because we do have a tendency to to dominate whatever environmental context we're in, to manage those environments and actually to over sort of exploit them. So I do wonder whether there was going to be room for them if the pre-existing historical timelines that we look at had happened as they did.
La seconda domanda è di Maria Grazia Campantico dell'Università di Ferrara, che si riallaccia alla presenza dei geni di Neanderthal nel nostro patrimonio genetico e chiede se oggi ci sono differenti visioni da parte degli scienziati che studiano questo aspetto genetico e soprattutto se ci sono anche contrapposizioni nel decifrare quelli che sono i valori di questo patrimonio che Neanderthal ci ha lasciato.
I think a clear answer is that nobody who works in genetic research has any doubts that the evidence that we see from our genomes and the evidence we see in Neanderthals and the evidence we see from fossil Homo sapiens, it all supports a narrative where there's not only one phase of interbreeding, actually there are many different phases. We can see interbreeding. The earliest evidence for this in Neanderthal cases is that it's before maybe 200,000 years ago, so very, very early. There's some kind of interbreeding. There's also definitely interbreeding happening sometime after that, but older than 100,000 years ago. And then there is this phase during sort of, between 55 to about 40,000 years ago, this last final period when Neanderthals are around and what we think is new dispersing Homo sapiens populations and contact between them. And in that period, there is many different phases, and we can see almost every fossil Homo sapiens we sample, we look in their DNA and we can see that they had ancestry from Neanderthals. Sometimes that ancestry maybe 1,000 years before they lived, there was interbreeding. But in other cases, we can actually see that the contact was much more recent before that person died. So only 4 to 6 generations before, so 200 200 years, maybe 400 in other cases. So there's no dispute over the evidence for that. It is accepted. And there's many interesting questions you can ask about this. Did the people who had this very recent ancestry, did they know that they had a Neanderthal ancestor? Like today, you can look back 4-6 generations, 100, 200 years ago, and if you have a family history, then you know some of your relations, but not all of them probably. But was that something that was so unusual in those cultural contexts that it would have been remembered, and that the heritage of that contact would have been maintained in the memory of that group and of that individual, of their family? So we don't know that, but it's a really fascinating question to think about. But altogether, the genetic evidence really strongly suggests that although the groups that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were living in, they're all small populations spread out in the landscape. But when they do meet, interbreeding is a normal thing that happened. We don't know if it was to do with violence or if it was consensual, but it seems to be a normal thing between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens and with Denisovans. And we even have, from the Denisova cave, we have a tiny piece of bone from the first generation hybrid, as in the child of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. We have their bone. And statistically, the likelihood that we would ever find one of those hybrid children is very, very small, extremely small, if it was a rare event. So I think this is all telling us that contact, interbreeding is a normal thing. And if you look biologically, look at all kinds of other animals, it's a very well accepted phenomenon that when you have different species, different populations of animals that have a close evolutionary history, interbreeding is really normal. Hybridizing is really normal. So we should actually probably have expected this with Neanderthals. And especially now we know the span of time over which they were in the same landscape is much, much longer. But in terms of sort of, I guess, thinking about the relevance or the importance or the impact on the groups, I don't think there's any dispute about the fact that the interbreeding happened, or sort of the existence of this genetic heritage in living people. But what we can see is that in living people, the Neanderthal DNA we have is coming from one particular phase of interbreeding around 55,000 years ago. And the people that lived after that were still interbreeding with Neanderthals, they didn't have any descendants who are still alive in Europe today. So there is a real complexity and a history to this interbreeding. But I think one of the other fascinating things to consider is that after this very long period of time when there was contact between those two populations, were the last Neanderthals even the same as the first Neanderthals? Because we've exchanged so much genetic material and maybe cultural ideas. So that's an interesting question.
Un'ultima domanda, Rebecca. Il futuro degli studi su Neanderthal è affidato più agli archeologi o ai genetisti?
Well, I would say that we're on the same team. Archaeology, I mean, Neanderthal studies today is immense. You know, there are hundreds and hundreds of archaeologists and hundreds of people who work on geochronology. There's lots of people who work on dating, and there's lots of people who work in paleogenetics. And that's why it's so exciting to study Neanderthals and to think about them. and write about them, because it really is true to say that there are still some mysteries about them, and often archaeology works, or the field of Neanderthal studies works in two ways. We have long-term projects that accumulate information slowly, and over time we can look at the richness of the picture and gain new understanding. But we also have individual finds or discoveries that they like explode our understanding at different moments in time, and genetics has been part of that. Absolutely, it's really transformed how we understand the closeness between us and Neanderthals, how we think about the social and biological and cultural interactions between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens in the past, and health impacts, potentially cognitive impacts in us today, and also just how we feel emotionally about Neanderthals. I think that's one of the biggest impacts of the genetic revolution that we've seen. And when you put that together with all of the enormous advances in archaeology, not only new 21st century technological advances in how we do archaeology, but also understanding the power of the archaeological record itself and just how much information is actually in there. And if we dig it carefully enough and slowly enough and are creative enough, we can find out unbelievable, amazing things about Neanderthals' lives. When you put all of those things together with genetics, it really shows the vibrancy, I think, of where we are in Neanderthal life. And all of that together has changed how people relate to Neanderthals, how they feel about them, what it means to have Neanderthal DNA still in us today. And, like you were saying at the beginning, you have an interest in space and astronomy and things like this. It's impossible not to, think that if we ever do colonize other planets or leave our solar system, we're taking the Neanderthals with us. And I love that.
Condivido, una bellissima proiezione verso il futuro che garantisce un fatto importante, che la nostra specie, che le specie che sono vissute su questo pianeta continuano ad evolvere, a crescere, scoprendo lo spazio, abitando lo spazio. A questo punto ridò la parola ad Alfredo Giacchetto, che ci ha seguiti in questo colloquio.
Io vi ho seguiti con grande interesse, non vi ho interrotti, era davvero una discussione. Dicevi tu, Rebecca, non abbiamo la macchina del tempo, è vero, però sicuramente non vuole essere piaggeria, ma il tuo libro ci permette davvero di viaggiare e tornare indietro di così tanto tempo con una narrazione così precisa, quale tu sei stata davvero in grado di fare nel tuo volume. Io voglio davvero ringraziarvi entrambi, ringrazio Giovanni, ringrazio nuovamente Rebecca e spero davvero di potervi vedere presto, per volta in presenza durante la settimana della scienza, ma soprattutto durante la cerimonia di premiazione del premio Galileo tra il 14 e il 15 di ottobre a Padova. In realtà io vi invito dal 10 al 16 di ottobre, quindi per un periodo più ampio che si svolgerà appunto a Padova. Voglio ricordare a chi ci segue da casa che il libro di Rebecca è edito da Bollati Boringhieri, quindi potete trovarlo in tutte le librerie, chiaramente in Italia da Bollati Boringhieri. E voglio ricordarvi anche il prossimo appuntamento, sempre ecco, esatto, ho un po' di copie anche dietro di me. Ricordo anche il prossimo appuntamento con Quando abbiamo smesso di capire il mondo di Benjamin Lavatou, il quinto ed ultimo appuntamento dei 5 finalisti. Il 10 di giugno alle 11 del mattino ci collegheremo anche con lui. Io vi ringrazio, troverete anche il calendario di tutti gli appuntamenti della settimana della scienza sul sito premiogalileo.eu e se volete seguirci su Facebook la pagina è premio.galileo.padova, invece su Instagram Premio Galileo 2022. Auguro a tutti una buona giornata e appunto vi aspetto presto a Padova. Grazie.
Grazie.